Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and in this video I'm going to be sharing with you my thoughts on a forum post that was put on the official Final Fantasy XIV forums just a few days ago. This forum post is about endgame gearing in Final Fantasy XIV, and it's posted by none other than one Sfia. For those who may not know who that is, he is a prominent member of the hardcore raiding community and a fellow FC member of mine. We've had him on State of the Realm a few times, and he has no shortage of experience when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV. He has done hardcore raiding from everything from World First, Savage, and Ultimate levels of progression to just grinding out his Island Sanctuary way too quickly. Seriously, Sfia, slow down.
He made a spreadsheet for his Island Sanctuary. Said it's one of the first times in 14 he's ever felt like spreadsheets were necessary.
But he made a very well-structured post regarding gearing in Final Fantasy XIV, the things he likes about it, the things he doesn't like about it, and I wanted to provide some more input on those things, or at least share my thoughts on what was posted, as it has been a forum post that has spread quite like wildfire. So looking forward to going over it. I haven't had time to read it up until this point, so let's see what Sfia has to say about endgame gearing in Final Fantasy XIV. Two things before I get started. One, feeling a little under the weather, so if I just seem weird, that's why. Number two, I'll include a link to the official forum post, and if you wish to participate in the discussion, while you can do so in my comment section, I do of course encourage you to go to the official forums and engage with this post, as that gets general visibility, and hence why Sfia posted it on the official forums and not just on some twitlonger or something like that. So as to not mince words, we're going to read everything verbatim, and then I'll react to it after that. Having played Final Fantasy XIV continuously since A Realm Reborn, as much as I enjoy playing the game and the complexity increases in harder content, the gearing has become progressively more and more stale. Right off the bat, I think this is a completely fair statement to make generally, regardless of how you feel about gear progression and trying to compare it to, of course, as people do, World of Warcraft, where we have very reliable, very set gearing processes. It doesn't make the gear any more exciting. It's more of a means to an end and not a real reward, I suppose, at the end of everything. It seems like the game wants us to feel rewarded for the content we do, but knows they have to give something of value in return back to us. And for gear, that's a less than exciting prospect. I want to start on a positive note and say the reliability. There you go. The reliability of obtaining gear over time is a huge success. Regardless of the time frame in which this happens, the core system of guaranteed desired drops is well done. People will have varying opinions about the time frame in which these should be achieved, but that number is more easily changed than the reward systems that currently exist, tomestones, and raid tokens. I believe it is important to maintain this structure while addressing some of the negatives that exist in the gearing system going forward. So a really good positive note to start on. I kind of just hit on it right before that, but we're of the same mind here, that we are glad that the gearing system, at least on the base level, is what it is. But that doesn't mean it couldn't be better. And I think a lot of people see posts like this as complaining or whining. You can love something and still want to see it be better. And that really gives that kind of vibe right off the bat. So very disarming, I suppose, initial statement here before we get into the nitty gritty.
I think you're also talking from the point of view of somebody who A, knows what they're talking about, but B, has engaged with this system every single cycle. And so there are people that don't feel this is stale because either they are newer to the game or they don't engage over and over and over and over. But he has seen reset after reset after reset after reset of here's the new gear progression time and time and time again. So knowing who he is also says that, like, this is coming from a place of, if you do not feel this could use a little help, some of what he's experiencing might be feelings you feel as you engage more times. Once you are on your third or fourth or fifth time chasing Biss, back to back to back to back, I think some of the things he's saying also really ring true because of his perspective from the people that are affected by this, as opposed to, like, I don't mind hunt trains right now because I haven't regularly capped home since Heavensward, and this is my first patch to start taking those seriously again. So I will likely agree with a lot of this, but I'm not really as burned out as these guys because when I started to get burned out on doing all this, I just didn't do it. But that means that, like, there's this whole idea that don't do it. Well, that sucks. Like, that's not a scalable answer of, like, well, if somebody doesn't like something about 14, they should just play something else. Or if you don't like the way gearing works, you just shouldn't Savage Raid or something. Like, you're denying something simply because they would hope it gets better. So I look forward to seeing what they say here.
So now let's go into the issues. To name some of the current issues. Issue number one. The rate of gear acquisition from tomestones is too slow, considering the game is heavily advertised and enjoyed as a one character can play all jobs system. Playing multiple roles or even multiple jobs within the same role in some cases, looking at you, caster, can result in simply taking far too long to acquire all the gear necessary to perform optimally on them. This makes gearing in patches before an ultimate especially restrictive. I was going to say, as I was reading this, this feels like something specifically for a raider that is clearing Savage, can clear Savage on multiple jobs, but needs to gear jobs for ultimate. That's really the only gearing hurdle we have in the game currently, or at least one that is enforced by the game itself. For ultimate, you really want to be as close to best in slot. And
yeah, I think also there's this idea that like Yoshi P himself said if there's not enough healers, you do it, right? Like that's effectively what he said. And so there is this idea of what if you wanted to switch to healer midstream? What if you wanted to do that? That would be very difficult. As far as it being too slow, there's two ways to gauge tombstone acquisition. The first is how many tombstones do you need to acquire all of your gear goals eventually? And that can be viewed in number of weeks. How many weeks from the start of the patch does it take to obtain all of the gear you would like from tombstones, which is not every single piece. By then you will have gotten some Savage pieces. Sometimes tombstone is just not really the best way to fill a particular slot. Maybe your crafted pentameld holds up really well, depending on the patch cycle and depending on the class. So like, you don't necessarily take, okay, here's the number of gear sets, here's the number of pieces per set, simply multiply that out. Like the extreme weapon on its own already says like, okay, well by the time you get the extreme weapon, you have things like relic weapon and the savage weapon, maybe you choose to skip the tombstone weapon. That's a huge savings in tomes, especially when you multiply it by a lot of jobs because weapons aren't shared. So you could view tombstone acquisition as too slow, and that sounds like they are coming from the point of the number of weekly lockouts it would take to obtain all the gear that I might want if I would like to play multiple roles or even multiple jobs within the same role in some cases, as he states in the following sentence. However, there is another direction that they have to balance the tombstone acquisition rate, and that is the number of minutes that it takes the average player to get it in an average week. And there are multiple sources of tomes, everything from hunts to dungeons to PvP and so on, but you can take the average player and you can say, we look at the activities they choose to do, maybe it's a mix and match, maybe they spam one thing, and they are doing this. If you're super optimal, acquiring all your tombstones for the week is like an hour, but not everybody wants to be super optimal, and some of that stuff requires that there happens to be a group that's doing exactly what you're doing when you want, and that you can be there for the entire time they're doing it, as opposed to people that hop on for 10, 20 minutes at a time, hop on throughout the day. That may be a little bit harder, and so instead of funneling everybody into the truly optimal method, let's say, what's the average player do? They do, you know, a couple of extreme expert roulettes a week. Maybe they grab a leveling roulette on another job, and so that kind of eats into their playtime, so they don't have time to grab those capped stones. Maybe they're doing a little bit of PvP, which per minute, especially if it's front lines with a little bit of weight, like if it's dropping in-game currency like Crystalline Conflict does, it's not a very fast rate. And so what is this taking the average player? 2 hours a week? 4 hours a week? Do we want this to become 8 hours a week? Do we want this to be 10 hours a week on the average player? So I think simply doubling tombstones is or increasing the tombstone acquisition rate, while it would shorten the number of weeks, it would instead just take the total number of hours across those weeks and condense those down, right? We would get it in half the weeks and trade for twice the hours, as one example. So like in general, this too slow, it ends up pushing from a couple directions. And even as somebody that's not wildly affected by this, the idea of changing it would both excite and concern me if you just use the word, they're changing it. Changing it how? And so do you cut prices? Do you increase tombstone drop rates? Do you increase the tombstone cap every week? Do you have prices change dynamically after you've acquired one piece? Once you've acquired one chest piece, are the rest of the pieces cheaper and cheaper and cheaper? Are they more and more expensive? So your first set is very, very easy. Like right now, it's very linear. 5 sets is just 5 times as long as one set if it's the same number of pieces. There is something about like, okay, What if it changes as, if, you know, let's make it very easy to get one job and then maybe a second job and then it gets harder, or the other way around, to really reward people that do multiple roles and multiple jobs by saying, okay, you've clearly got it under control. It's going to take less time now, because honestly, why would you keep grinding tome gear towards the end of a patch cycle if by that point, because of how many you do per week, you're already pushing up against the next gear drop?
The amount of gear you can reasonably acquire between a Savage patch coming out and an Ultimate patch coming out is to some degree limited, largely hindered by tomestones, which are weekly capped. I have even mimicked some of these statements recently, saying they need to let loose the reins a little earlier than they are right now. We used to be even more restricted. They started giving us the Savage unlock a little earlier, but it's still not always in the greatest of positions. So I totally feel with him on that particular level. But I think...
So they're talking about Ultimate here. Ultimates drop in odd-numbered patches is kind of the trend line. That's because you would not want an Ultimate at the same time as a Savage. And so if an Ultimate gets pushed from an odd patch, it gets pushed to the following odd patch. And if it doesn't make that one, it gets pushed again. And so you have 0.1, 0.3, 0.5. Releasing one in 0.5 means that it only has one patch cycle before it's now considered legacy content, and has to deal with the fact that we're 10 item levels higher. There's classes that maybe didn't exist before. There's abilities that didn't exist before. And so it really doesn't get a chance to live out its life quite like a 0.1 or 0.3 patch does. So what they're talking about is that grind between the 0.0 and 0.1, or 0.2 and 0.3. Our patches are now on 4-month cycles, so you're looking at roughly 16 weeks, assuming that you're going from 0.11 to 0.21 to 0.31, because they're going to shift there. So you're looking at roughly that kind of 16, 17 week time. So you are capping at 17 times the cap of each of those weeks. Currently, we're looking at that like 450 cap. So you've got right at 16 weeks. So that's the number we're all working with, assuming we want to live in a world where everybody is expected to cap every single week of a 16-week cycle. Heaven forbid we create a system that allows people to play 15 out of 16.
I think it's also the only level to which it really applies, because everything else in the game doesn't really have a tough enough gear requirement to stop you from playing whatever you want. Now, I see even disregarding, so I'm assuming that's going to refute my point here, even disregarding content which is desired around best in slot gear, there's a social expectation to bring the job with the highest gear. This is reinforced by item level restrictions on the party finder, increasing as the tier progresses. Yes, so as I said, the ultimate is the only thing the game enforces. The player base, on the other hand, can be just downright disgusting about what their item level expectations are. I'll give you a great example. There's been word of healer shortages as of late. So what did I do? I said, I'm going to go into the PF as a healer. Let me join some clear for one, some helping of friends, and see if we can get some people through P5, P6. Minimum item level 615. Now, the raid hasn't even been out for 10 weeks yet at this point. It hasn't been 3 months. But I have spent all that time gearing my first job, my main job, Monk. I haven't really had spare tomestones, or I haven't had that many to put specifically towards healer, because I also need to gear another job potentially for ultimate ranged fizz. I always keep that as a backup. But I'm like, I got full item level 610, I got healing gear, I make sure to meld it, I got food, I got pots, and I'm generally knowledgeable about these encounters. I won't be a hindrance even if I don't have as much experience as, say, a career healer. So let me go join these PFs, and bam, I can't, because full item level 610 crafted gear is, what do you know, not item level 615. Now, granted, the solution to this, I guess, isn't necessarily more gear. It's joining parties that aren't setting item level restrictions so high, but they're...
Not to mention, item level restrictions ignore the fact that sometimes your 610 penta's really good, so like item levels aren't reflective of whether or not he did choose to slot that materia versus didn't. You also have to set an item level across the board, and so maybe you say, you know what, it's been fairly easy to get past a DPS check if everybody's a 615 in the DPS role, but I think, because we're short a healer or a tank, we're willing to move a little bit on that, and so you end up in kind of a weird spot where, like, it would be easier to lower the requirement on the healer if everybody else had a little bit better gear, but you have one flat item level requirement across the entire party. So before you look at any problems with just assuming that item level alone will fix what somebody's doing, and I'm not at all clamoring for like a rating system like what Mythic Plus became in WoW, there is this idea that like an item level restriction across the board you feel kind of dumb when you're locking Mr. Happy out of offering to heal your clear for 1. And so I've seen this in WoW when somebody who is like a Mythic Plus Invitational player is being kicked from parties because they're on the wrong spec.
They're more and more frequent. So it becomes an issue with the game, despite the fact that it is a player-enforced restriction. This restrictive gearing timeline results in feeling like after spending a single tombstone on one job, I'm locked into that job for the remainder of the progression cycle. Yeah, I mean, that's completely true. People have even brought up the idea of like having at most a week to refund the piece and spend the tomes again, but after the week, whatever piece of gear that you have, it just kind of resets. I've seen a whole bunch of things where people who are not 100% sure.
I've never seen them quite have the tech for that. World of Warcraft can put a literal timer on a piece of gear before the bind sticks, so that tech would be really possible.
And they might need a little bit of reconsideration. Do want something like that, and if you buy multiple pieces in a week, that gives you a greater deal of flexibility to make the decision, as opposed to just being like, oh, I'm about to hit, cap on my tombstones and I don't really know what I'm going to gear all the way up yet. There's a lot of little nuanced bits to it. But one of the greatest parts of the Final Fantasy XIV job system is the ability to play all jobs on one character. With the current gearing system, I'm limited to one role per patch, depending on what I play. Yeah, I felt this a lot more in Endwalker, and again, I do think it is because of the community's perception of what is an acceptable amount of gear to bring to various levels of encounters. And as such, I've had similar feelings. I've called for similar things. I think we can allow gear to be obtained more easily earlier on. At the very least, by the time the odd-numbered patch hits, some limitations probably need to be brought down, even if not outright removed. Because some, plans when it comes to joining for an ultimate, or plans when it comes to trying to help out friends, etc., etc. The longer we're restricted from doing those things, the less we're likely to engage with those systems. So if I'm able to, let's say the loot lockout for Savage is completely removed in the odd-numbered patch, right on the patch, not at .x5, .x8, whatever. Suddenly, whether or not I'm doing Ultimate, I've now had this kind of freedom opened up that allows me to engage with the system more, even if I'm not engaging with it for the gear. But if I am someone engaging with it for the gear, I'm now given this window with which I can focus on gearing those other jobs before the next Ultimate even comes out. So I think that is really the crux of the issue. It's the freedom. And when it comes to tombstones, I have said I think they might want to consider raising the cap about at the same time, about the time we get the odd-numbered patches. So whether or not they want to go all the way to 900...
It seems like something Criterion Dungeons could have solved.
Like they do at the end of the expansion, that's on them. But I do think that needs to be taken heavily into consideration, because as we get more and more jobs, this is going to become more and more of a problem. There's another issue I want to touch upon, but it might be touched upon in one of the other points. So if I have to, if I remember, I'll come back to this. But great first point, completely agree, and curious to see what the rest of what he has to say is. All right, number 2, substats are a problem for balance and creativity. What creativity? And I think that's probably going to be the point. But yeah, we actually had a whole video about this as of late, talking about the problems with our substats, but I'll read this and then reiterate and add to it if I need to. In the current landscape of Final Fantasy XIV job design, there is an issue with damage variance from pull to pull, right on track. This is largely due to the design of both critical hit and direct hit stats, combined with the high burst damage profiles the game has trended towards, 2-minute buff windows. My major gripe with substats as they currently exist is the lack of impact. There's only one job remaining in the game which has any interaction with substats, Monk. I'm assuming he's talking about critting, giving you chakras. Yeah, I mean, they've gotten rid of pretty much all the rest of them. It's just you either auto crit or you auto proc, or, if you do proc, it's a chance on just an attack and not on an actual crit. So yeah, I mean, that's been pretty much all removed. Part of an appeal of RPG games is the character power growth and the feel that has on gameplay. As it stands, the only feedback I get that I am more powerful as a black mage is that my critical hit Xenoglossy hitting for 61k instead of 60k. And I want to add to that, because we had numbers in Shadowbringers that were brought down, as one would expect, the feeling of that impact is only relative to what you had just experienced before. But because we experienced something much more powerful before, even that doesn't have quite an impact. It's not even just the difference of 1k, it's knowing that at some point I was doing more than this, and even more so, I'm getting back to that value quite quickly, which almost informs the player that we'll probably have another stat squish, if not this expansion, the next, or they need to do something else to change the formula going into 7.0, because they probably didn't squish us enough to make it so that we get enough feedback from...
It's why I thought that when they originally described why Shadowlands squished everybody, I really thought they'd kind of solved it, where you just get us in the habit of getting squished every 2 years. Like, if the squishes have to happen, stop holding off so that I, like, forget what it's like, so that I have to feel you, like, let the hair grow back, so you have to rip it off every single time, and you let it grow all the way back, and then you rip it off again. Stop doing that. Like, just make that part of an expansion. Every expansion, going into pre-patch, we drop everybody's stats down, and then we build up across the course of an expansion. It just felt really odd that they, like, took all that impact to say it's this dynamic system, and it's about getting back to the roots of an RPG, and then you're like, okay, cool. So what are we doing coming out of Shadowlands? And like, oh, the same thing we've done in the past. So, like, from 14's perspective, I was really hopeful that WoW would kind of set some examples of things we could learn from that are positive, but I haven't seen anybody that is a true vertical progression game that has 5 or more expansions not eventually run into this issue where the numbers just get too freaking big.
From our stats to see that growth. It just feels like you took a tiny step back from the previous expansion, but not enough for it to be a long-term step. Let's see. Tenacity currently is a completely undesired stat. You can say that again. With the way incoming damage in 14 works. Spike damage profiles do not mesh with the low value of Tenacity's defensive stats when cooldowns are so powerful in comparison. Yeah, I wonder if it's a programming issue. I can't remember when I had this discussion with somebody else, but we talked about how Tenacity should probably bolster the actual effectiveness of defensive cooldowns because that's more in line with the game. But the problem is, even that, we have a very good balance of the way we can use our defensives. If we get a stat that makes our defensive stronger, I don't think that's any more appealing. It just is more well suited to this game and the way damage profiles are done as explained here.
I think another thing is that because we don't allow any form of analytics, because we don't allow any form of meters, the big numbers is the exciting thing. And that means that the only numbers that are getting shared are all DPS numbers. And, like, by and large, I see people talking about their individual DPS over and over and over when people do talk about metered numbers. And I feel like if we could start to get a pane at the end of an instance telling us how we did, there would be an opportunity for them to reshape that argument. There would be an opportunity to shape the view of what these numbers mean. And so if you could start to, at the end of an encounter as a tank, see amount of mitigation, amount of damage taken, amount of damage mitigated, amount of avoidable damage taken, and then damage dealt in that order, you could start to say, like, as a tank, your job is to help other players not take damage, and to do so by taking as little health as possible. Through the form of mitigation, require as little healing as possible. But the game doesn't teach me how I'm doing, and so if I'm a tank managing my cooldowns very well, or if I'm a tank that is not managing my cooldowns well, the healer might feel it, but I don't. I really don't. My health is a little bit rocky, but I don't notice the difference between good pulls and bad pulls. And so I think the game could better reinforce, and it's one of the things that I think has made healing really unappealing this particular patch cycle, is that if you get in a group and all you do is sort by item level, you have no idea whether or not I as a tank am even gonna use mitigation for some of the hits I take. And some of the hits I take hit hard. And so that's just... So it's hard to want to invest in tenacity. It's hard to want to invest in defensives when, like, he's saying there's plenty of defensives on the bar, but as a noob, it would be easy to not really understand the value of defensives whatsoever.
When cooldowns are so powerful in comparison. Yeah, hence why I think Tenacity would have to do that. But I mean, that's even why Tenacity has a damage component on it, because they understand that damage in 14 is more valuable than everything else. And the community has made that clear again and again and again. So outside of outright changing the value on outgoing damage in the game, which I don't think is going to happen ever, how do you make Tenacity a useful stat? And that's really the only way. At the very least, if somebody's defensives are a percentage stronger. You know, you'd have to work in, you know, micro percentages when it comes to defensive cooldowns, because you can't have like a 32% Rampart or like a 45% Sentinel or something like that. It can't be like massive numbers that it jumps up, which then of course comes to the issue of whether or not it's even worth it, if it feels like game design, you know? The final major point about substats is the lack of interaction with speed stats. Generally, they are hugely undesired outside of low thresholds and then completely avoided. They create anti-synergy with job abilities in many cases and are sometimes out of the player's control. Yeah, this is a big thing. So first, I'd like to say there's no point in both skill speed and spell speed being a stat. We could probably just have haste and call it a day. But that's not a solution. That's just a high-level observation of this. Yeah, speed stats are so very rigid in Final Fantasy XIV because of the way these buff windows are designed. You're always trying to get an exact number of GCDs, an exact placement of those GCDs, or as close to exact as you can possibly get within a set period of time. There's very little, I'm doing the thing that my job is good at, and during this time, those things are just better. It exists to some degree, like Black Mage. Yes, Black Mage does have a proper 2-minute, like what they want an ideal window to look like, but it's a good example of something that's a little more fluid. You want to try to time getting as many fire casts in, getting your Xenoglossies, make sure that you use your gives you a free Xenoglossy, but I haven't played Black Mage much since I leveled it. Yeah, you just get a bonus Polyglot, essentially. You want to make sure all those cooldowns are lining up with 2s, but you're not sitting there trying to do exactly the same thing. You're not trying, you can move around and work around it a little bit better. Every other job, if you are like not on the GCD you need to be on when you go into a 2-minute window, you are screwed, and you're probably going to continue to be screwed for the rest of the fight, depending on how skilled you are at the job to adjust it, or how forgiving that job is even in the first place.
So there's a couple of things he's bringing up here, and as kind of a noob that's come from chasing WoW gearing, but has always kind of capped 14 as a much more super cash state, the first thing he's talking about is haste. So haste capping is, so there's hard caps and soft caps. So let me just talk about some of this terminology just so that like my words make sense, because he's better at talking in smaller words, and like I don't know, he's just better at communicating than me. So a haste cap, as I've always heard it referred to, is kind of a number that you want to clear. And there's soft caps and hard caps. So a hard cap is something that once you have it, you're done with it. And missing any of it is problematic. World of Warcraft used to have a hit cap, and you just needed to have that exact number. No higher, no lower. You need to hit that number. It is a hard cap. You must be there. We will not invite you to the raid with less than that. And any of that stat over that number isn't really doing much for you. So, since their system allows for, imagine if there was like 30 materia slots, and so you could move, push, and pull a lot more through the act of like getting different gear pieces, having different materia slotted, and they have different systems that have allowed them to like to reforge base stats. They've done different things over different expansions, but basically you had a lot of movement, and what might happen is you get your Savage Gloves this week, and that means you need to remeld your boots, because the Savage Gloves have more of this hard cap stat on it than your existing ones, and so you need to now pull hit off of your boots to get you back down to exactly the cap. Then you have soft caps. Soft caps are something that, like, more is better. A little bit of it definitely helps you with things like latency, sloppy play. This already happens. But what ends up happening is there's these thresholds, and these very much exist in 14. And so there are these thresholds where back when inner release, for example, on a warrior was a time window, where in that time window you can press Fell Cleave as many times as humanly possible. But you've got a cooldown. And so as you shorten that cooldown, it's just a fraction. The difference between being able to fit 4 Fell Cleaves inside of inner release and 4.5 is no additional damage, because there's no such thing as a half button press. And so all you're gaining by adding haste, by adding something that speeds you up to go from 4 to 4.5, is flexibility. That now if I just make a mistake in movement, I have an extra half global that I can dick around in front of the boss because I'm busy concentrating on some Lamatod call out of brilliance, and I'm like, oh, he's calling me to push the thing, and I miss it. That gives me some extra brain time or latency if I'm somebody like Ren Karagani that unfortunately has made the decision to live on the East Coast and play a game that's West Coast based. So, like, that's where that helps. But beyond helping for latency and your own just human latency, the issue with the guy on this side of the keyboard, it doesn't really do anything until you cross a threshold where now it's 5 fell cleaves inside that same window. If you can speed it up enough to get 5, now we've got this massive 25% jump onto what inner release does. Now what this does is this wildly incentivizes stat priority, this wildly incentivizes optimal play, because the people that are getting 5 inner release fell cleaves are just way ahead of the people that are only getting 4, either due to gear or player skill or both. And so they got rid of this going into this expansion, moving us to a charges system, so that even if you end up in a phase where the boss disappears and goes off and has tea and comes back, as long as they come back relatively quickly, you're guaranteed the exact number of fell cleaves. It doesn't even break your combo. If you need to toss a tomahawk, doesn't even break your combo. And that's meant to make it very casual. But what that has done when paired with people that are optimizing for the caps that do exist within the game, and what people are doing is now we have shifted to a 2-minute design window, and he's talking about this. And there's a big post, there's a big long written post from, was it Momo? There's a big long written post that kind of explains this. But basically, if every 2-minute window is where all of the buffs exist, all of the multipliers, and every 2-minute window is all where all the big hits exist, the big old fell cleaves, where I'm slamming my axe, or in my case a hammer, down on the boss's face, then all your big hits want to be on top of all your big buffs, because you're taking your biggest numbers and you're multiplying them by the biggest percentages. And what that has meant is that any class that it's easier to accidentally slide off those 2-minute windows because of class design, or more importantly in this context, any player that is Mr. Happy Notes makes a mistake ever and slides their stuff off of those 2-minute windows, everybody else is over here doing their big party. They've got their big hits, they've got their big buffs, they're all having a party. But because you have made the mistake of making a single global cooldown mistake and you are off, you've now been uninvited from the party. And you're way over here watching them have their little fiesta, and your numbers are taking huge, huge hits. Even if your rotation is perfect from that point forward in the fight, you are still, as he puts it, screwed.
For a lot of jobs now, isn't very many. So it just makes this really weird balance of speed stats. Essentially, I hate to have to say this, the speed stats kind of like accuracy at this point. You want exactly enough and no more. And
because gear is shared, how do I have exactly enough for different jobs with different rotations? What happens if I have a job, let's say, hypothetically, I have a job that is like a magic caster, and every other cast they cast is instant cast. Well, then it feels like I'm getting a lot of casts per second, so maybe skill speed wouldn't be as important. But what if I was a class where I had to stand still for a long period of time to cast big booms, where maybe skill speed would help me feel like I could dodge mechanics a little easier? If we're taking this as like a form of balance and creativity as a player, before we even talk about what it means within some theoretical sim, I, as a player, can already picture that as the big boom caster that feels like maybe I'm going to like put a circle on the ground and I'm going to try to stay inside that circle, hypothetically. And that feels like something that I would want to be able to get my cast off really quickly while I'm in that circle, as opposed to the guy that I could cast on the run. Maybe spell speed is not something I give a crap about, but they share gear. So the fact that Materia is gear bound, not jobstone and weapon bound as the primary, there is Materia on weapons, but not on jobstones, already just further punishes this. So it's already something that they've slid further and further away from my perspective. But then on top of that, it doesn't feel good when a job finally gets creativity, like Warrior has a different set of melds than the other tanks, and so it's like, wow, I have like something creative. Oh wait, I wanted to try out one of the other tanks. Oh, now my gear is bad?
obviously there's a difference between how fast you're hitting and whether or not you're even able to land a hit, but it's the same mentality. And I guess there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but playing with different speeds is less of a personal decision on what feels good and more of an ideal circumstance. And I think that if there was anything that could make jobs more varied or different for players. It's more jobs that don't interact so strictly with the speeds. That comes down to just designing what the breakpoint windows look like, and that's very nuanced. I couldn't go into every job and all of that right now, but a complete truth. You know, it's funny. I actually thought he was going to touch upon something else that comes up a lot with substats in 14. It's not just that we have these high variance substats in the form of crit and direct hit, combined with high damage profiles, which lead to very swingy damage variance, but that our substats in general are not a strong point of Final Fantasy 14. You essentially have crit, direct hit, determination, and then whatever your stat is for, and then, you know, your speed stat, which, you know, you try to get to a set value, and then whatever stat is kind of exclusive to your role outside of direct hit, because direct hit, despite being a deep...
Yeah, speed stat has effectively become that hard cap, and hard caps are a lot less exciting than soft caps. Soft caps are exciting because what happens is as you gear up across a patch, you build up enough gear that you realize, oh, like imagine if as your item level went up, you went from being able to equip 5 materia to 10 materia. What would happen is as you got more and more total materia slots, you would realize, now I can get enough that I can actually make it over the next threshold. But because they moved it to this kind of hard cap, it's just something you set and forget.
DPS stat that's designated for the DPS role affects everyone, but Piety and Tenacity are specifically for healers and for tanks. So there's not very many of them, and the ones that provide the most damage will always be the most valuable. So it becomes a question of, do we just need different substats? People have suggested splitting critical hit and critical hit damage into 2 different stats. Does that actually help? We probably need our gear to have a different substat profile then. We probably can't just have 2 stats, because if crit rate and crit damage still are the most influential, then it becomes about stacking those 2 specific things. I recently had a discussion about mastery, a stat that could potentially affect your job in a particular way. Now, I'm not going to spitball what every job's mastery should look like, but the idea of going for a stat that boosts some specific effectiveness of your job, there's at least a chance that some jobs will choose to interact with that stat more, and other jobs will choose to kind of keep it at a set value. So it ranges anywhere from a stat that is highly desired to a stat that has some desirability, but not a whole lot. And you really want different jobs interacting with the different stats.
Yeah, like if you could jack with the amount of gauge that something generates, or you could jack with the potency of certain themes of abilities, you'd create a lot more build variety. The downside is I'm immediately wondering how you balance that across jobs that have, decided to get lumped in with jobs that have a different focus. And so if Reaper and Dragoon want different things in that case, because Reaper is just like, oh, I'm gonna have my avatar out like all the time now because I'm max mastery, and Dragoon's like, I don't care about that, I just want to be jumpy boy, and mastery doesn't affect that, right? Like, I think the speed thing, I think the frustration with the speed thing really showed in jobs that wanted different speed, and so adding another stat like that would just further make the fact that our only form of gear customization is effectively materia. And the fact that materia, I don't know, maybe if it's like a different food staff and or a different food stat and a potion stat, so it's just something that you equip. I don't know.
That's on some systematic level, so that decision making is even present. However, even if we do that, going back to point number 1, another thing I'm very surprised he doesn't hit upon, it's not just that the gear has this acquisition rate that's low. It's even when you're within your own role, which again he touched upon in the previous question, it's that sometimes you just don't even want the same piece, or you don't want the same meld, or you want something slightly different. So, maybe every time you want to swap jobs between one of the casters, you got to change a meld. Nowadays, people are better at finding kind of these universal sets that at least work with one gameplay element of another job. So like if you want to go full spell speed, Summoner and Black Mage can get identical, close to identical for what they want. But now you've got Red Mage out, so he's like, oh, well, then I should probably go crit, because at least I can somewhat use that across all the jobs. But that's because skill speed and spell speed become so rigid. All these things just counterbalance each other. And then when you can only have one piece of loot and you can't do anything about the melt.
And if speed could only go on your weapon, right? And then you had to use more speed materias to make a greater materia to go in there, so it consumed it at the same rate, because every time we dropped, it dropped as like shards, and they went in, or your weapon just had a bunch of speed based slots. Your weapons just had more slots. We've had relics with like all this stat on them. Like if we could I don't know, deca meld our weapons, and then that's where all your speed had to go. I don't know what that looks like. You know, I'm very much the noob in this conversation. But the fact that speed is not something you want universally across a job, and every piece of gear except for your weapon might be shared, and if it's not shared, it's because like, oh, I took Savage as pants, but the whole thing gets convoluted, because job sharing is one of the greatest values to casual players, and it has just created a pain point for anybody that tries to start playing optimally.
Other than every time you want to swap, taking one out, putting one in, taking one out, put one in, whatever you have to do. It's restrictive in that regard as well. And that's been a complaint that Yoshi P himself has actually acknowledged, but that they haven't had any solution for since then. So again, these first 2 points really kind of dig into each other in a lot of ways. And I don't think Final Fantasy XIV needs to have a crazy amount of subsets. We don't need like lots of every piece has this like unique effect and everything like that. Could we? Probably, but we know the ramifications of that are balance related, and we also don't want that problem, because then we have to have this video about that, and the other video we made about balance looks like nothing compared to the discussion we end up having to have as a result. So
build variety versus homogenization is also directly affects the likelihood that the game is balanced and that you can truly play whatever you want. So you don't want full homogenization because it's boring, but you don't want full build variety because there will be builds that are just gods compared to others.
What do we want to achieve here? We want to achieve better stat variety, less damage variance, more interaction with substats, and improving the substats we even have at the moment. That's a lot of things to cover. And you want to know the crazy thing about it all? Technically, if none of those things happen, Final Fantasy XIV would not have any more problems than it has now. And realistically, our problems with these kind of things are, again, not I can't play this game, it's like this problems. They're I love this game, I just want it to be a little better problems. And because of that, if none of this changed, which it probably won't, I'll say it, it would just be Final Fantasy XIV still.
The big drama about this game's balance, the last tier, was after people were already clearing it.
And unfortunately, when something has that degree of impact, when it's almost barely noticeable by most people, even a lot of you watching this video are probably just wondering why we're wasting time talking about this. It just probably doesn't matter as much compared to getting gameplay out there, getting new content out there, focusing on job balance at the start of an expansion, what the new skills are, you know, all of that stuff. This seems like something that only people of our caliber are really after. People who look at that character growth and substat kind of mini game that you play in RPGs, but probably not the wider audience who just kind of enjoys Final Fantasy XIV for what it is and isn't so concerned about stuff like that. It's one of the toughest things about these kind of posts is you have to know where you kind of stand compared to everyone else, and the unfortunate answer is not probably in a point where this is a majority opinion, and thus change is not always super likely. Going on to point number 3, there's a lack of varied methods for acquiring max item level gear. Okay. Currently, a best-in-slot character interacts with tomestones in the latest Savage raid. Having only 2 sets of gear means acquiring best-in-slot is more restrictive than it should be. More available max item level gear sets would result in the ability to gear more jobs simultaneously, while also increasing the speed at which to obtain the total best-in-slot. A great example of a previous piece of content which added more gear was Proto Ultima side quest in Dunskaith. Is that a good example? Proto Ultima was at the end of an expansion and was added in like a 0.5 patch after we'd had Dunskaith available for quite some time. It gave us max item level accessories, and it gave it at a time where the raids had been out for so long that no one really cared how you were getting your item level at that point. You know, you could already get weekly upgrades for tomestones from the 24-mans. You could just get, you know, the equivalent of an unupgraded tomestone piece from the 24-mans. So I guess this answer really depends on when you want that kind of gear to become available, and how much you value the difficulty of that content versus the rewards it gives. There's a big discussion actually with Criterion right now. People wondering why we don't have tombstone upgrade materials, at least in the normal mode. You know, the savage mode people initially said should probably have it, but realistically, it's the normal mode that's probably the better option for it. But that's not a new gear choice. That's access to, that's better.
I think there's... This debate gets really hard, because if you create multiple methods of getting max item level gear, that becomes the expectation, back to the earlier point, in things like Party Finder. And so you can say that's a player-enforced thing, but as Mr. Happy noted, there is a very real thing where he went to join a Party Finder and none were available to him, because that's the way things were. And that's... When the things are working really well, that's really exciting. Like when Elian Gray comes in here and shares Prime, that's amazing. But when things are going less well, when somebody comes in and is setting party finders too high and you can't find a group, that's really frustrating. So I think upgrade materials tied to Criterion seems to be the universally most accepted method that would require the least work on their point, rather than focusing on Proto Ultima.
Better access to upgrade gear we currently have available. So it seems like he more wants optional side stuff that gives item level relevant accessories. I mean, we have had that. That's not the only example, but in the earlier days of Final Fantasy XIV, this was a little more common, and I never understood why they moved away from it. I think they started valuing the difficulty of the content versus the item level it was required, or that it was providing. And they seem to be afraid to bring those things closer together than they already were. And they were pretty close. They still are to this day, just because of, you know, what your rewards actually look like from a 24-man on any given week. So what really is the solution to this? I mean, because making whole new gear sets is probably not the most achievable thing unless you want to recycle more old gear sets and use them as higher item level. Do you just raise the item level rewards of certain things? This is one of those things that feels like it is more manpower related. Like you need more people to be able to design enough gear to even do this sort of thing. But the question that...
The fact that gear is always released at one quality from things and you can't just like push the quality. If you could scale your gear up more times, maybe there's a unique upgrade item from Criterion that pushes you to 628 and 630 instead of 630 or something like that. And then the question is, well, then does that discount the jump from 628 to 630, or are you just doubling the work? But like the fact that there is a lack of variety of methods means there's also a lack of levers and knobs to turn. There's a lot of advantages to that. It makes people not feel overwhelmed. It keeps it much easier to balance. It keeps you from feeling obligated to doing more content than you want to do. But the downsides is that when you ask for something more, there is very little in game for them to pull on 20 different levers and say, okay, we're going to push this one back a little bit and we're going to pull this one here. That just doesn't exist in 14.
Then becomes, you know, what type of content? I mean, he lists a 24-man side quest here. That's very easy content. Do we also want something that's still challenging? Or at that point, because it's catch-up gear, do we not care? It's just about weighing the options. I think, as I mentioned earlier, that catch-up gear should become available more quickly, because people who or just get tired of doing the other set want something else, another option for gearing alts or even their main if they haven't been putting as much time into it. When hardcore raiders actually want more gear for other jobs that they want to play, or alt characters, or any number of reasons they may want to be able to gear something else up a little more quickly. So this is one of those things, there's really no argument against it, but how you do it is the question. If you just take the most direct route, or if you try to develop something in the process that gives you those options. I didn't even mention upgrading crafted gear. I mean, maybe you could even do like a super upgrade for crafted gear, you know, like from something you reward another thing that allows you to upgrade the crafted gear even further, just like you would upgrade tombstone gear. That's a potential solution, going all the way up. Imagine getting that crafted gear at the start, doing the first upgrade for 10 item levels, and doing a second content related upgrade for another 10 item levels. I mean, that doesn't inherently sound bad either. And that's the thing, a lot of these ideas aren't bad. They just need to fit within Final Fantasy XIV's content structure, or new content needs to be made around that fact. So yeah, I mean, this again ties back to the first point, in my opinion. And number 4, this final point is much smaller and more to do with current Savage release schedule and its interaction with the Criterion release. The Criterion Dungeon Savage mode was targeted towards players who had cleared Abysso Savage early in the tier and acquired plenty of loot. Unfortunately, it released at the start of the 8th week, meaning those wanting to go into content immediately were not yet guaranteed certain items requiring 8 books. Funnily enough, this came up during the live Q&A from the 14-hour broadcast. Somebody said, yeah, I'm really looking forward to it, but it's the 8th week, and like now it's a clash, and we want to go get our gear and make sure we get the rest of what we have. So this becomes a question of, is Criterion Savage fully geared towards those best in slot people? I think it's more geared towards them, but not so much so in a way that if you had been raiding for 7 weeks up to that point, that you'd be at a major enough disadvantage going into that week. I think that it's definitely worth considering going back another week on Criterion, but I don't know.
Criterion also has no rush. Because of the rewards, the one advantage is that if you are in a group that maybe, for example, only has 5 books because you just didn't get there, there is no rush. If you say, let's just come back through when it's 8, you could just wait. Unless you're going to world first push Criterion, it does not have the same feeling that, maybe I'm reading that wrong, but it just feels like it, because it's so lack of rewards and because there's just 12 paths in that invariant and there's just one path through, there's just one set of 3 bosses, it feels like if you blitz it, you're doing yourself a disservice, as opposed to you got 4 bosses, you got 8 weeks, get to work. This is like, no, you got 3 bosses and 12 normal modes, true normal modes. You got to stretch that crap out. Because I think with the amount of rewards from Criterion, people are like, yeah, I cleared it once or twice, and then, like, unless you're wanting some of the cosmetics from it, it is all cosmetic. I saw people like, I don't even want the chair. Well,
it's this one's another tough one because it does depend on what the exact internal item level is. Because again, we're talking about the Savage difficulty, not the regular difficulty. But the fact that it does clash specifically with the 8th week, if it continues to, will be a problem amongst the target audience, and that's really the important thing here. So yeah, no, that's a completely fair ask. I don't think anyone likes the idea of waiting another week for content. Well, I guess that's not true.
And when do they release? This time we're getting it on 0.2, 0.4.5 as the half patch content. So we should be getting an even and 2 odds. So what is it going to be moving forward? Are we going to get a Criterion every odd patch? Are we going to get it every even patch? If it's every even patch, does that include launch patch? Because sometimes launch patches, because it has all the things like MSQ and new zones, we trim things like, for example, PvP seasons sometimes get pushed back, or Unreal gets pushed back, because honestly, there's plenty to do. So then do we do 2 Criterions? One on 0.2, one on 0.4? So like, I think the other question I have with what does it mean for loot is like, I don't even know where it slides within the loot life cycle.
True, I did ask for it for Savage for however many years before we finally got it, but a lot of people aren't a fan, so I'm the anomaly.
He did. He asked for it way before Asmongold. I like Asmongold, but I saw both Zeppla and Asmongold, more Zeppla than Asmongold, take a little bit of credit for the Criterion thing. He asked for this a long time
Anyone
ago.
likes the idea of waiting another week for content? Well, I guess that's not true. I did ask for it for Savage for however many years before we finally got it.
Yeah, Ryan and I asked for it. He asked for it. Lots of people have asked for this.
A lot of people
Frosty's asked for it.
Aren't a fan, so I'm the anomaly. And so that's definitely something to take into consideration. I think even Yoshida had said they would take it into consideration going forward when that question got posed on the live Q&A. But yeah, that is the last point. I want to reiterate that the positives of the current gearing system are a huge benefit to existing and prospective players. This post was made with the hopes that the gearing system can be even more appealing to a wider audience. Yeah, I feel like he achieved that. I think that might be why some of the points I brought up aren't in his post, because they are things that are more nuanced and not kind of high level. You know, they're ways that we interact with the game on a very personal scale.
He's saying he's asking for the week delay. Okay, well then I know he asked for that. I know Miztech asked for that. I know that. Okay, then once again, Saga, I will double down on my point. A lot of these things are long requested, so it's hard to hate on them too heavily when this is the first time we've gotten them. This is the first time we've gotten the week delay to Savage that wasn't tied to an expansion launch, where it's the 2-week delay, and this is the first time we've gotten Savage. So whichever one I heard from him there, or you heard from him there, either way, these are long requested things. So all of this is in the context of we have just now gotten a lot of long requested changes to the way this works. So it is very much like, I love this, keep going.
Scale. But I don't know, with an RPG, I feel like those are also points to consider. So these things we need to consider, especially the first 2 points, and then as an extension of the first point, the third point, how people feel as they're getting the gear and how that gear has an impact on their gameplay. But as I guess as an RPG junkie, I can't help but look into the nuances of it and try to think of what the absolute best solution is and how it interacts with the game as a whole. And that's a big question. I don't think any one person can answer that. And even if you think you do have the answer, it's probably not as simple as that. But a really good post, one that we rarely see these kind of posts, you know, the one that is genuinely criticizing the thing that somebody enjoys, looking to make it better and improve it for everyone else and themselves at the same time. So Sfia, great post. Again, if you want to interact with the post and get it more visibility on the official forums, please see the description of the video for the post. And of course, feel free to comment your thoughts under this video as well. But that's going to be a wrap for me analyzing what Sfia had to say about gearing in Final Fantasy XIV. With that, I will see all of you in the next video. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share. And until then, take care.
Very cool. Very cool. I appreciate him giving some context there. He has a lot more knowledge on this, and I think Sfia wrote this in a way that is reasonably understandable, but having him to kind of parse that down for me is a lot easier. It's not a system that wildly affects me, but like, there is also an argument to be said. I think Preach said this when talking about the Covenant system in Shadowlands, that when, you know, the top end community, or Ian in charge of World of Warcraft, said like only the top end people are going to min max, and he's like, well, there's a difference between wanting to squeeze out the last little bit of power and just wanting to not suck. And so while yes, like, I think that's how he said it. So I think there's a logic to like understanding that for this person that's squeezing it over here, somebody else is kind of following in their footsteps, and they're not going to try to climb all the way to the top of the mountain, but they're not going to stay just at base camp. They want to not suck. They want to be on the path to getting better. They're following the same North Star. They're not hiking at the same pace. They won't make it to BIS before it resets, but they are pursuing it. And I don't want, you know, I don't want to suck. Just because I'm not where they're at doesn't mean that I'm like, well, then screw it. Before I step back into Savage, I do want to have my gear all the way melded. I do want to have more food in my bags. I do want to have more flasks. Even though somebody could go, yeah, but you don't even have your rotation down. Okay, that's fine, but like, let's not make it worse.